The purpose behind this podcast and channel is to remind us all that we are burdened both with the responsibility and with the opportunity that comes with free choice. See, what I believe is that we're born into a conventional commercial banking system today. And the most liberating thing that we can do at the me and the you level is to secede from that conventional banking system and to become our own bankers. Hello and welcome to the Durham Talents channel. My name is Jesse Durham. Welcome to our 100th episode here on the channel. I know we've got a lot of series and playlists and different types of content that we put out, but from the beginning, I have started with what for me has just been long form conversations about real, pragmatic, nuts and bolts information to talk about becoming your own banker, to speed up your learning curve on becoming your own banker, to help you in vetting this idea that you can become your own banker. And I've always encouraged everybody, go to the book, go and read Nelson Nash's book, Becoming Your Own Banker, his first book. And then he has a second book, and we're going to get to that later in the episode today. But he has a second book called Building Your Warehouse of Wealth. So we've been at this now for some years, and we've gotten to this 100th episode, and it all started by me. I mean, we did some, they're still up right now, some videos where I would just pull up my phone and I'd be inside or outside, and I would just start from day one sharing my best practices of having picked up Becoming Your Own Banker in 2015 myself, and the learning and the experience that we have gained along the years. My wife and I, our 3 children now, that's not what we looked like when we got started, of course, but that's where we're at now. Me, my wife, our 3 children. We have multiple policies with multiple companies. We've conquered a lot of debt that we had at the time of first being exposed to this idea of becoming your own banker, paying off student loans, paying off a family vehicle, financing family vacations, all different types of things that we've talked about here. But just in case you haven't heard any bit of my story, I'm going to give you my story, but the theme of this episode, and this is what we're going to dive into, and I believe that my story plays into this theme just like yours. If you're already a client, you know. If you're vetting this idea, you're finding out. Congratulations to you. I commend you on your learning journey. But the idea, the topic, the theme behind this particular 100th episode, it seems so good to me to talk about how Nash would say that this is the way for us to bring banking back to the me and you level, and that there's this idea that we can just secede. We can decide not to participate. We can take our ball and go home. That's something we would say as we were kids. If you don't understand that particular analogy, I hope you're getting these others. We can just decide not to participate. We can decide to, and I would say this in all areas of life, live freely, independently, autonomously. And certainly when it comes to the banking function, this banking idea, it's not a new idea. You can find it in scripture from thousands of years ago, of course, where 3 individuals had some money. They did different things with it. They performed at different levels, but one of them went and buried it in a hole in the ground. And there's just a ton of lessons right there. And that's actually the parable of the buried talents. That's where we got the idea behind our channel. I've said before, perhaps I haven't said it enough, that the idea here is to dig up buried talents, okay? To be able to realize the potential that is truly, again, our responsibility, but also our opportunity. Okay, so my story. I said we were going to get to my story. So back in 2015, I had a good friend call me up and say, Jesse, I just heard about this idea that you can become your own banker. And he just started talking to me about it. I was driving down the road. He was driving down the road. He was telling me about something that he had found out about, heard about, and he was excited. And he was just giving me his version of what he had grasped so far. And he said, there's going to be an event. Some guy's coming in, going to present the idea. I was thankfully at an open-minded time in my life to learning new things, trying new things. I'd adopted the idea that, well, okay, worst case scenario, I go and I look at information. Worst case scenario, I learn something. Maybe I don't participate. Maybe that's not for me. Maybe not right now, but I learned something. Worst case scenario. So thankfully, I was invited to this event, got to sit down and watch a live presentation that was an introduction to the infinite banking concept. Sure, I got to ask a bunch of questions at that event. That was very helpful to get some personal questions answered about what I'd grasped so far and what my remaining questions were at that point in time. I was encouraged to read Nash's book. I did. I got Nash's book, read the book. I've reread the book several times since. Told my wife about it. I knew from the time that I was first exposed to this idea and I heard that phrase, you could become your own banker. I knew I wanted to do that thing. I wanted to do that for myself. I loved the independent and the tones of freedom from that phrase. So lined up a call with a professional. We decided on what was a pretty significant premium for us, got our first policy. It was on me. Our second policy that we did get soon thereafter was on my wife. So we owned two policies in a matter of a year or less for sure. I mean, it seemed to go really quickly. But we'd gone through those steps and we had those policies and it was a big deal for us to write those first checks. Again, we were paying significant premium. What was significant for us at that time, a considerable percentage of our cash flows. And we immediately started tackling debt, like I mentioned earlier. And we did. We have no student loans now. We have no conventionally financed vehicles. We've been able to do a lot of things. We've paid property taxes. We have financed family vacations. We've used our policies for all sorts of things. And as our family grew and our system of these, let me say this, just in case you are seeing this for the first time. When I'm talking about these policies, I'm talking about properly structured whole life policies with mutual companies that pay dividends from the start. So we now have, sure, a system of 6 policies at the time of this recording. And our family has grown. Of course, we have 3 children now, like I've mentioned. So it naturally progressed and grew over the course of time to where, yes, with our first policy, we took our very first steps towards seceding from that conventional financial system. And that I've put out a lot of information about what that looks like. And of course, my biggest recommendation is to read Nash's book, Becoming Your Own Banker. Another one that I haven't mentioned yet in this episode but I have before, is How Privatized Banking Really Works by Carlos Lara and Dr. Robert Murphy. Those were personal friends of Nash's. Excellent book. Highly recommend. I was just speaking this week with an individual that's going through our process. Voracious reader. He's already read Becoming Your Own Banker. He's dove in now on how privatized banking really works. He's seen Nash's documentary that's out on YouTube and the internet. And I love those types of conversations where I'm having a conversation with somebody who's just about to get their first policy. We're at the very end of our process, just about to get that first policy, but they've been through the book and they've been through other recommended readings from Nash. It's incredible. So again, our story was with that very first policy, we did take that first step, and the first step being mentally deciding to secede from the conventional banking system, right? But putting our money where our mouth is. Okay, we talk about a lot of sayings here, and I believe that's good because it allows us to evaluate the things that we say and decide, well, is that a valuable thing to say? Is that a valuable thing to think? Or is it not? So mentally, we decided we wanted to become our own bankers. We put the rubber to the road. We put our money where our mouth was, capitalized our very first policy, immediately began using that policy to pay off debt, recapture debt. And then again, over the course of years and years now, we've been practicing this concept 8 years. We've just grown that system. We've grown how we've used our policies, and we've continued to grow our understanding of this infinite banking concept. And all along this way, I certainly could have said some things about, growing up with a father that worked in the same factory all of his life, many long hours, hard hours, stay-at-home mom. We had a big family. She was super busy. So I just had this real, what I felt like was, an average upbringing where I knew nothing about finances, nothing about personal finance, certainly nothing about the particular function of banking, didn't know anything about insurance outside of what was conventionally propagandized. And then of course, when I did get into careers, sure, maybe an employer offered a certain amount of term insurance. Maybe when I was a high school Spanish teacher or in law enforcement, someone would be paraded in front of us to tout different products and things, and we could make a selection, sure. And we were encouraged to, put our money away for the next 30 or 40 years, of course, and not touch that, to eventually have a nest egg and all those conventional things. And sure, let's get to banking now. So that was the conventional message, of course. But of course, after I read Nash's book, I began to realize, well, what about the banking process that's taking place over those 10, 20, 30, 40 years that are supposed to lead up to this gloriously relaxing retirement at some arbitrary age? So even from reading Nash's book, of course, I've had a big paradigm shift on what I think about retirement, passive income earning years, valuing the productivity of our 40s and 50s and 60s and 70s. Okay. And some of y'all might not be ready to hear that, but I would encourage you to read Nash's book. I'd encourage you to look at his recommended reading, and I would encourage you to consider that your 40s and your 50s and your 60s and your 70s are probably going to be your most productive years. Now, that doesn't mean that you do the same things that you did when you were in your 20s and your 30s, right? Because there are two ways to earn money. People at work, okay? Money at work. So the power, of course, the potential of not burying your talents and covering them up and forgetting about them, hoping they'll be there when you get back. Well, there's so many things there. We can't go there. I've done an episode just on that. I'll put some notes up here about which one that is, where you can find it. The idea of burying your talents. But the banking function is going to be taking place. I'm here to say that just like I was exposed to this idea one time, if you've been exposed to this idea, vet it for yourself. Research it for yourself. Let's have a strategy call. Let's talk about your questions. Let's talk about your particular financial situation and what it could look like to get started and grow a personalized, privatized banking system. Okay, so that you can secede from the conventional banking system. Do you know, have you heard me say yet that the average American, and I just get it from Nash, that Nash says that the average American is paying out 34.5% of every dollar that we earn in interest alone? The banking process, the banking function exists. Banking exists, and somebody controls it in your life. It's my belief now, with the knowledge that I have, that it's my responsibility and my opportunity to account for my own need of finance, and that it is your responsibility. You can choose to abdicate that if you want. I don't believe that you're the kind of person that wants to do that if you're listening in. But also the opposite side of that coin is the opportunity of what that can do for you. If you reascertain control of the banking function in your life, you start thinking long range, like Nash would say. I mean, intergenerationally. What if the next generation doesn't have to conventionally finance at all? Cars, homes, continuing education, their weddings, their vacations. Fill in the blank. It's the infinite banking concept. But you got to think long range. You can't hesitate to capitalize. You can't be afraid to capitalize. Your capital has a cost. Who do you want to control it? Who do you want to be able to benefit from compounding it over your entire lifetime? Who do you want to have access to it? Okay, these are just worthwhile things to ask, but that's a principle from Nash. Don't be afraid to capitalize. Certainly don't do business with banks. Again, we've done a lot of information here on banks. But I'll ask that real quick furtive question of, aren't banks the nicest buildings and the nicest parts of towns with the best kept grounds? Okay, who pays for that? You do. I do. Don't do business with banks. We don't own that. There are dividends earned at the bank also. Do they share dividends with you? No, they don't share them with me either because we don't own the bank. They pay a pittance of insurance on the money that we do leave parked there, stagnant, lazy. And then we're taxed on that, of course. And they're just making multiples and multiples out of that by paying attention to the natural law of motion the whole time. And we're missing out because we've abdicated that. Don't do business with the banks. And then, of course, be an honest banker for yourself. When you do begin this process, when you do take that first step of getting that first policy, be an honest banker with your policy. Don't steal the peas. Don't walk out the back door. It's your place. Be an honest banker. And then, of course, rethink your thinking. And I believe, and so those that I've just mentioned, those are 5 principles from R. Nelson Nash. Think long range. Don't be afraid to capitalize. Don't do business with banks. Be an honest banker yourself and rethink your thinking. So with those 5 principles, with me recapping now on the 5th of rethink your thinking, I think that's the value of me revisiting Nash's book. We're in 2023 now, so I don't think I've made my way all the way through becoming your own banker just yet this year, but I did last year. Okay. So I reread Nelson's books, all of his books. I reread Nelson's books, and I like this kind of a venue, this kind of a platform where we can let iron sharpen iron. We can share best practices, get your questions answered. Just continue learning. I've not arrived. You've not arrived. We've not arrived, folks. So being open to rethinking our thinking. So I know I've shared my story about being exposed to the infinite banking concept, and we've covered some of my thoughts about the conventional banking system, but let's hone in on a few more things here. We don't talk about a lot of the important things that we should. Again, our folks that are listening to this information, of course, I believe that we are making an effort to have intentional, purposeful conversations with those that we love, with those that we are doing life with. I mean, when you go about getting, and if you've not heard me say this, let me say this here, a bit more on my story. Before I saw IBC, and I was just telling a prospective client this the other day, we were talking about whole life insurance, just in general, outside of knowing anything about the infinite banking concept like we do now. When I saw that you could have permanent whole life insurance, something that you're going to own for your whole life. You could even decide, okay, I want to pay these level premiums for the next 10 years, 20 years, 30 years or whatever, or maybe for all of my life to capitalize this private asset. And it's eventually going to be tax-free transfer of wealth, such as it is. And again, not ideally structured policies for the banking purpose, just plain Jane vanilla whole life insurance. I owned a policy on me. We had a policy on my wife. We had a policy on our first son that was our only child at the time. We owned multiple whole life policies before we knew about the infinite banking concept because it's a great asset. Now, of course, I would be willing to share 16 characteristics, and I've done an episode about that too. I'll put up information about that. The 16 characteristics of what I believe is the ideal asset. And there might be more. That's great. But I'd arrived at liking whole life insurance. Of course, knowing what I know now, we want properly structured policies with mutual companies that pay dividends. No question about it. But I loved whole life insurance for what I understood it to be, even at that time before knowing about the infinite banking concept. But people are in general having these conversations about money, about setting up the next generation. And when I say setting up the next generation, I'm talking about education first. I'm talking about a great library. I'm talking about good life lessons that we learn together. I'll tell you this. I can't remember if I've ever said this before. A couple years back, my boys and I had went and found a property that we wanted to get. It was a nice little lot, nothing done with it, and there was an old structure on it though, and the individual that was going to sell that parcel had some stuff in that building. And what I had done was I had taken my boys with me, driving around. We'd been looking at properties and talking about properties, and It's just something we've enjoyed doing. And for this particular one, before closing day, we just took it upon ourselves, and I did it more for wanting to make the process smooth, sure. Lend a helping hand, absolutely. But I really was being intentional about letting my boys come with me. Here's what I'm saying. That property owner needed to get some things out of that old structure. We offered to show up that particular day and help get some things out. And we're loading a truck and we're loading a trailer and all these types of things. My boys are running back and forth, and the gentleman that sold the property gave my boys a couple of little flashlights. They still talk about him. They still talk about that. So it was just a wonderful, beautiful learning experience that we had. And what I'm saying is let's just be considerate of what the next generation is going to be starting with. It's a pity, in my opinion, feeling the way I do, knowing what I do now, that every generation just seems to be starting from scratch. And in that way, I mean educationally, I mean practically. I mean, I want to put some tools in our children's hands. I want to put some tools in our grandchildren's and our great-grandchildren's and our great-great-grandchildren. See, if you don't know, when I started this podcast, when I started this channel, for me, I knew that I would be satisfied just to have an avenue to put out my best practices for everyone. But if only my children, if only my grandchildren, if only those in my family could watch this information, listen to this information, and gain something from it, then I wanted to be able to do that. And, my question to you, and I heard this recently, and that's why I'm thinking of this. I mean, what would you do to be able to have access to some video or some audio content from your grandparents, from your great-grandparents? I mean, how cool would that be? So I've been satisfied from the start to put out this information about becoming your own banker if my boys and my little girl are the ones that hear it, and then they share it with their children and so on. That's great. But of course, we've had an opportunity to help folks all over the country by answering their questions, by getting them properly structured policies with good companies, helping them speed up their learning curve on this infinite banking concept, helping them, once they have that policy, to use it and to continue their learning process and to be accessible and be able to dial things in and work with folks. I love it. It's been a great blessing. But the next generation doesn't have to start from scratch, and I don't think it should have to start from scratch. If we are willing to secede from the conventional way of doing finances, if we are willing to secede from the financial slavery that commercial banking is. It's financial slavery. I love Nash's second book. He's got his second book. It's called Building Your Warehouse of Wealth. And in Building Your Warehouse of Wealth, I believe it's at the end. I believe it's actually right at the very end. He's got this section in the book where he's talking about out of Egypt into Babylon. And this isn't from Nash's book, but I recently heard, and I liked it, is a good way of thinking about it. Somebody recently said that it took a short time to get the children of Israel out of Egypt, but it took 40 years to get Egypt out of the children of Israel. So that was just an interesting way of saying it. But Nash, in his book, Building Your Warehouse of Wealth, he's got this section of the book where he's talking about out of Egypt. And that's great. You get out of this slavery and some time goes along and maybe not enough lessons are learned. History tends to repeat itself, etc. And they end up slaves again in Babylon. So again, I commend you for listening to this information, for being on a journey where you are open to rethinking your thinking and being an honest banker and thinking long range, planning intergenerationally. These are the kinds of folks that I love having conversations with, and I enjoy hearing about your wins, and I enjoy hearing about your journey, and I enjoy hearing about, your takeaways, and every time that we have a chance to talk. So when we recognize that everything is finance and that the conventional banking is taking our deposits, lending those out at multiples, charging interest on that, money that's been printed, money that's just digits on a screen, money that did not exist prior to us signing a note, and we pay interest on it. It was made up, and we pay real money, interest on it. And here's the difference, right? When we decide to become our own bankers, what we are doing is we are engaging in a private contract ourselves with an insurance company. So it's a unilateral contract. We're saying, okay, we're going to pay X amount of premium on this ongoing basis. That's our part of this relationship. Your part of the relationship is to provide this guaranteed death benefit, guaranteed cash value, access to leverage that cash value via policy loans or withdrawals, etc. So it's just private individuals contracting with each other. That's freedom. Me deciding to do business with you, you deciding to do business with me, and us locking in something that is mutually beneficial. I love it. Now, this makes me think of something that I read recently, and I wanted to make a point out of this. Let me reference my notes here. It was 1964. That's right, 1964. The Ford Mustang cost right over $2,000. Did you hear that? In 1964, the first year that the Ford Mustang came out, and I was reading this from the autobiography of Lee Iacocca. Anyway, it was right over $2,000 for a brand new Ford Mustang. Now, I'm mentioning that because when we are having a conversation about banking, about money, we need to recognize that when we secede from a conventional banking system and we begin privatizing our own private banking system, our capital is then compounding forever into the future. We're taking depreciating dollars, and here's where I'm getting ready to make the tie to the Mustang. Depreciating dollars to fund this appreciating asset. And here's why I put that price out there on the Ford Mustang. Who today wouldn't want to come up with a couple $1,000s to go get a brand new Ford Mustang? I don't care if you're a Chevrolet fan or not, right? So again, the value of money, here's another real simple way to look at it. What did a candy bar cost 50 years ago? What did a candy bar cost 5 years ago? What might it cost 5 years in the future, 50 years in the future? Okay. So, and that's just one aspect. If we have a discussion about inflation, I've already been talking about how banks, and I believe that's part of the bigger picture. I mean, we're here to talk about banking at the me and the you level. No question about it. But one of Nash's principles is don't do business in banks, because if you are doing business with banks, you're part of the problem. Our deposits are funding that scheme. Now here, let me make a note. I know lots of local bankers, beautiful people, wonderful people. I'm talking about the function. I'm talking about the way that that business is run. If I were printing up money or digits on a screen, lending that out, charging interest, I'd be thrown under the jail. Okay, but banks do it. It's not a problem. Okay, I'm not talking about the people. So what are we doing then to account for something particular like inflation? Well, taking depreciating dollars and funding appreciating assets sounds really good to me. Okay, you got to imagine that you can have access to this vending machine, and in the beginning you're capitalizing this. If you look at it as a new business, which you should, that's a good way to look at it mentally, to look at a policy that you're beginning to capitalize. There's no loss of value. It's inherent in the asset itself. There's no loss of value. But there is a capitalization phase where there is a loss of liquidity. I mean, if you're buying the machine itself, renting out the space where it stays, getting the food items, etc. on the inside, there's a capitalization phase, okay, that takes place. You have to capitalize that. But of course, over the course of time, that machine just gets more and more efficient for you, because the costs have been absorbed, etc. So there's no loss of value with a properly structured whole life policy with a mutual company that pays dividends, but there is a loss of liquidity in the beginning years. Now, make no mistake, you can access the majority of your premiums via policy loans even in your first year on a brand new policy. That's why I've already said that it's the ideal asset. But all the same, this banking is a process. So there's this loss of liquidity while you're going through this capitalization phase. But just imagine a point in time where you put $1 into this machine, and whereas maybe in earlier years you'd get 60% out, 70% out, 80% out, 90% out, you eventually get to a point in time where you're putting $1 in and you're getting more than $1 out. Or you're putting $1 in, because we're talking about banking over the course of your lifetime, and then of course eventually banking intergenerationally. You put $1 in and you get multiple dollars back out. So that's just one way to look at something particular like inflation. We could talk about taxation. We've already mentioned how even if you do earn interest from leaving lazy dollars in a bank, we're taxed on that income. So they're making use of our money, and then they tax us on the pittance that they allow for us in the meantime. And then, of course, it would behoove us to consider other things like our exposure to litigation or the risk that we're exposing ourselves to, right? If we don't secede from that system and we participate in that conventional system, okay? Whereas in practicing the infinite banking concept, we don't have to work any harder. We don't have to assume any more risk. We don't have to lose control. We don't have to change our cash flows. We can start right where we are. So for everyone that's tuned in, that's a client, I appreciate you. Thank you. If you would, this is our 100th episode. Let me know down in the comments what's been your biggest takeaway from the podcast and the channel so far, or anything that you feel like sharing. I'd really look forward to reading that. If you're vetting this idea about how to become your own banker, about what is this infinite banking concept, I encourage you to read Nash's book, Becoming Your Own Banker, and I encourage you to contact us. I'd love to have a conversation with you about how it could look if you were to implement infinite banking into your household, into your business, into your investing, whatever it is that you already have going on. You could just add that one step, secede from the conventional banking system, and you benefit from that responsibility and that opportunity. This has been a great pleasure for me. I look forward to our next conversation. Have a great day. Take care. It's going to be good. Hello and welcome to the Durham Talents channel. My name is Jesse Durham. Or don't say that. All right. Where was I? I need my list. I need a paper list. I need to do that. Hey, Jesse, don't forget to do that thing. All right? Yeah. What else? 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 We did an intro. We did a welcome. It's going to be great. 100 episodes. Wow.
Oh, Jesse, can you believe it? 100 episodes?
Oh, no, Jesse. That's great. 100 episodes. Oh, it's lovely, lad. Well done.
Jesse, 100 episodes. It's amazing. What is it? It's spectacular. It's marvelous. It's stupendous. It's wonderful. It's incredible. Fantastic.
It really is commendable. 100 episodes. It's staggering.
This one might be my new favorite. Why, Jesse, I commend you on your 100th episode, sir. It's really impressive.
Bravo, Jesse. Bravo indeed, sir. 100 episodes. Highly commendable. Bravo. Yes. Well done, old chap.
This is 100 episodes.
Oh, this is wonderful.
No, that's too much. Okay.
100.
100.
100.
100.
100.
100.
100.
100.
100.
100, precious.
100 episodes.